Okay, man, every new lesson just feels so exciting because you're learning something that's like really bringing you close to making awesome web applications with React. In this lesson, we're talking about changing state. Okay, having state in your component is great, but if you can only initialize it to a specific value and can't change it, then frankly, it's kind of pointless to be there. And it's really no better than just hard coding it into your code. So let's learn about changing state. Now what we have here is a component that is a class-based component because we're using state. We have our constructor. We're calling super as always. We're initializing state with a property called count and setting that equal to 0. And then in our render, we simply have an H1 that displays the current count. And we have a button with the word change in it. I've added a little bit of CSS so it wasn't quite so ugly. And now we're going to learn about how when I click this button using the event handlers that we just learned about, how can I change the state to be something different so that clicking the button will actually change the value that gets displayed here. Well, let's start by adding an event handler, which should be reviewed from the last lesson. So go ahead and see if you can make it so that when you click a button, maybe something gets logged to the console for now. Okay, remember to add an event handler. I'm going to do onClick in this case because I want it to handle the click event equals, and then inside of curly braces, I'm going to put some kind of JavaScript function. Now I could put an inline function right here, which I don't particularly like. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to create my own method. Okay, constructor is a method that's built in to classes in JavaScript. Render is a reserved method name for React. But in between here, I can put as many methods as I want. One strong convention that people tend to use is to have a method called handle click when you're handling a click event. So I'll finish the stubbed out version of this, and then down here, instead of an inline anonymous function, I'll have it run handle click. Now let's see if I can get a console log to show up. We'll save that. And this is a common mistake. When the method is part of my class, I need to reference it on the this object. So this dot handle click. Save again, click my button, and it says I'm working. Okay, that worked. Well, that's pretty boring. So let's make it so that when I click, it actually changes my state and increases my count. Now, one thing that would be really tempting to do is to try and modify state directly, as in typing this dot state dot count equals 1, or saying something like plus plus. But this is something that you will actually never do. You're never going to want to directly modify the original version of state. You might remember in the introduction to state, I talked about how state is kind of like the clothing that you wear. Well, when it comes time to change your clothing, you don't modify your clothing, right? You don't paint your clothing a different color. You don't cut a t-shirt and sew on buttons so that you can have a button-up shirt instead. But what you do is you completely replace your old clothes with your new clothes, or rather the clothes you were wearing with the clothes that you want to wear. And this is essentially the same thing we're going to do with state. You also might remember that I talked about some kind of goodies that we're going to get from React.component. And that's the reason we're extending React.component. Well, one of the things that we're going to get is a method called setState. And anytime you want to change state, you're going to use this method, setState. And it's a method or a function, so I'm going to call it. And there's actually two different things that you can pass to setState. Let's first look at the easier one to understand. What I can pass to setState is a new version of state. Well, state is just an object, as we see up here. So I can pass to setState an object, and I can say the count is now 1. You might have already figured out what's going to be the problem with this, but let's see if this works. So once again, my button has an on click that will run this.handleClick when it's clicked. This.handleClick uses the setState method that comes from React.component, and it provides a new version of state, okay, like your new t-shirt that you're putting on. And it says now the count should be 1. I'll click the button, and we run into a very common error. It says cannot read property set state of undefined. This brings us into a realm that's actually kind of hotly debated with React, and I'm going to give you a very simple solution to this that may not make a whole lot of sense at first. Essentially, anytime you create a class method that you want to use setState on, you're going to need to bind this method to your own class. If you're not really familiar with binding, I'm not too worried about that right now. Just know that anytime you write a method that uses setState, you'll want to bind it. And the way you bind it is inside of your constructor. We're going to say this.handleClick equals this.handleClick.bind this. Like I said, this is probably pretty confusing if you're not familiar with binding. But essentially what it does is it makes sure that the handleClick method is bound to the context of this as it exists within this class. I'm going to refresh this and click my change button again. And awesome, look, our state changed from 0 to 1. Now this is where the problem that you may have figured out already comes into play. If I click change again, it looks like nothing's happening, but in fact, it's actually doing what I told it to do, right? When I click the change button, it sets the state to the count, and the count is now 1. Well, it was already 1, and I'm changing it to 1, so it's actually not changing. Therefore, I can't see it changing on the display. So that brings us to the second way that I could use setState. If I don't care about what the previous version of state was, passing in an object is a really nice, simple way to provide a new state. But a lot of times we actually do care what the previous state used to be. In this case, we want to know what the previous state was, and we want to add 1 to it. So anytime I need to know what the previous state was, I can also pass a function to setState. That function is going to receive in its parameter the previous version of state. This is really important, and it might be tempting to think that you can just access the previous version of state using this.state, which sometimes will work, but oftentimes will not. And so it's really important to always pass prev state, or whatever variable name you want to give this, to your function. Now, because it's an arrow function that just has one parameter, I can get rid of my parentheses around that parameter. And what my function should return is a new version of state. Okay, so before we provided just a new version of state directly as an object literal. But this time we're providing a function that returns that object literal. The benefit of doing it this way is we have access to the previous version of state. So in my function, I'm going to return an object. That object should have a count property so that I don't break my this.state.count down here. And I want you to take a second and see if you can figure out what the value of that property should be. So pause the lesson and give that a try. So remember, prev state represents the old version of state, and the old version of state is an object. So I can access the previous version of state by saying prev state, but that's the whole object. I just want the count property. Again, I'm not going to say plus plus, because that's directly modifying the old version of state, but instead I'm going to just add 1 to it. The computer will do is it will figure out what the count used to be, it will add 1 to that, and it will set that as the new count property of my new state object that's getting returned from this function. Now when I save this and refresh, and I click change, I can click it multiple times, and it will continue to increase the number that's displayed on the screen. And this is really cool. I mean, it seems kind of lame because all I'm doing is increasing a number, but this opens up so many possibilities, and you're going to see from here on just how much we're going to be able to do with React now that we have the ability to have components maintain their own data in state and actually change their own data using setState. I mentioned before that you are allowed to pass state down to other components as props. For example, having a child component of some kind that receives, your count through state. And if we were to define this child component, we would see that it's receiving a prop called count, the value of which is the current state of its parent component, app. Well, what React will do is anytime this value changes, anytime it sees that there's a child component that's receiving a value that changes, it will re-render this component. It will run that component's render method once again, or if this is a functional component, it will just run that function again, so that that component can reflect the new version of props that it's receiving. And in this case, it will change every time the state.count changes on the app component, which, as we just made it do, happens every time we click the change button. So right now, child component isn't actually defined, so I'm going to get rid of that before I get a syntax error. And let's do a quick recap of everything we did. We have our h1 displaying our state, which just has a count property. We initialize that count property to 0. We added an event handler to our button that runs a method called handleClick. HandleClick is a method defined on this class. And because HandleClick is using the setState method that comes from the parent class, react.component, we need to make sure to bind it, which we can do inside of our constructor. And once it's bound, we can run setState, which can either take an object literal, which is the new version of state that we want to pass to it, or if we care about what the previous state used to be, we'll pass it a function that takes the previous state as a parameter. And that function should return the object literal that represents the new version of state. Now, I just rattled off a lot of jargony stuff, so I want you to spend some time with this. State is going to be extremely important for you to understand, and we're going to be using it pretty much through the rest of the course. So spend some serious time with this. I'd highly recommend, as I have in the past, try deleting this entirely, writing it from scratch, or probably a good stepping stone to that is rewinding this video to the beginning and seeing if you can add all of this stuff again. You're also welcome to try adding different events that may also change state. You can play with the state that's getting changed. Maybe you want it to increase by more than 1 or something like that. I don't know. One really good exercise is to have a button that will double the number and another button that will halve the number. So there's plenty of things that you can try to do with this. So use your creativity and your imagination, see what you can come up with, but spend some real time with this and play with it. Then in the next lesson, we're going to get a chance to practice this.